I, Shilpi Agarwal, on behalf of Center for Management Studies, Jain, deemed to be University, Bangalore, take this opportunity to welcome you all to our webinar. Our topic for today is Teaching, an amalgam of negotiation, performance, and struggle for acceptance. Now, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Shivlinga Swami HK. He is currently the chairman of Department of Studies and Research in English, Tumkur University. Professor Swami was conferred the PhD degree by Bangalore University for his work on exploration of existentialist philosophy in European and non-European fiction in 2009. He has participated in several conferences, workshops, and refresher courses as a resource person. His publications range from literatures in English to literatures in Kannada. Currently, he has been contributing articles on current affairs to Kannada dailies like Prajavani, Kannada Prabha, and Praja Pragati. He has produced 3 PhD scholars. The ongoing research work under his guidance has been on caste, religion, nationalism, gender, etc. Now I warmly welcome Professor Swami to address the gathering.
Thank you so much, Shilpi, for that introduction. Like the anchor said about, mentioned about the topic, I'm here to say a few things about teaching. Of course, keeping only my experience as a teacher in view. And in the last 18 or 19 years, I have found teaching to be a kind of an amalgam of all these 3 components. You have, of course, negotiation, which keeps happening almost perpetually. And in the meanwhile, there's also something called performance, which is expected from your side. And in the meanwhile, the last thing is very important, a kind of a pathetic struggle that we all are involved in to be accepted. And these 3 components, in fact, actually form the bulk of our experience as teachers. And this is what I actually feel. And this is a personal stand that I am taking. And when it comes to negotiations, I have prioritized negotiation here over the other 2 components because so long as you are a teacher, there's always an assumption that you are an autonomous speaker, an autonomous being. But what actually goes unnoticed is we no longer are autonomous beings. Instead, we are always constantly being regulated by so many bodies. And one of the things that we are faced with today is something called obligatory education at higher education. And what I mean by obligatory education here is in case you want to make education obligatory for kids. Primary education could, of course, be very much okay and it is welcome. But it's a kind of an unfortunate situation that prevails today where we are making available even higher education for everybody. And when you have higher education being available for everybody, it becomes a kind of an overwhelming burden for all of us, the teachers, because we are going to have students with absolutely no proper educational experience. And once they happen to knock the doors of higher education institutions, things become extremely complicated for all of us because of the existing mixed abilities inside the classrooms. And what I mean by mixed abilities here is some students might have got very good educational experience and they might definitely have certain kind of preparedness to receive whatever you give them as instructions inside the classroom. But there could be, of course, a lot of other students who may have knocked on their on the doors of your university and who may have come with, of course, a huge bag of dreams, but with not much of educational experience. And there comes the problem of negotiation, and you will start questioning yourselves whether or not you got to somehow change your conception of teaching now. Because when it comes to addressing such students at higher education, you may have to keep changing your pedagogy almost every now and then. And things have changed so drastically for us today in the field of teaching that we don't really have the comfort of sticking to one kind of teaching. And every time we walk into the classrooms, we actually are faced with students with different aspirations and different learning desires. And here, when it comes to obligatory education, especially at higher education, we have to somehow shape up their minds to even find jobs. And we all actually made our entries into higher education institutions, hoping that we have to create only thinking individuals. But such kind of a utopian world doesn't seem to exist. And even if it did, it must definitely have existed for our ancestors, maybe in the yesteryears, but not really for us. And we are here faced with certainly a pathetic situation where we got to address mixed abilities. And some of you might definitely think that it's a very welcome challenge. It is, of course, a challenge, but it's not really a challenge that you would want to mount every day. And one fine day, this becomes insurmountable because you also have to give them PhD degrees. And another very interesting policy made by our UGC is it's making PhD compulsory. Just think about this. And PhD used to be done only by those individuals who had this passion for research. And this passion for research, in fact, had to be driven by their preparedness and their educational background, their orientation in thinking. Many factors do count for doing PhD. But now that it's become mandatory, like how degrees are mandatory to grab positions in government sectors and even private sectors, PhD is now being taken up by all individuals who clear their masters. And now PhD also is likely to become completely diluted. And you have to somehow make compromises. So your negotiation will not end with your PG students. Your negotiations will not even end with just your UG students either. You got to keep doing that even with research aspirants who come to you with pathetic educational background. To share with you my own experience in the area of research, I've had candidates who actually come up to me after registering for PhD to ask for topics. And they have certain naive questions where they might even spring surprises upon us by asking for not just topics, they also ask us about what areas could be interesting for them. And here it's actually the reverse that we hope for. Students who want to do PhD, in fact, have got to approach you with certain kind of preparedness, having read something, having done enough groundwork for PhD. But now that UGC has made PhD compulsory, students need not come to you with enough background. Instead, in the coursework, you got to give them the required background so that they'll become prepared for your PhD course. And now PhD has become a kind of a headache for most of us precisely because of this. Obligatory education, obligatory higher education, and obligatory research. One fine day, there could be a policy where there could be common research topics, because we've already faced a situation where there is this proposal for common syllabus for all universities of Karnataka. And in the days to come, in case we are faced with common themes for research, then PhD will of course lose its sanctity. And this negotiation will not end here. It actually continues forever. And I've only given you just one point of reference, which is precisely mine. And I keep doing this negotiation almost every now and then. And I have had instances where students make mistakes in writing their own titles. And such people have got to produce a thesis of about some 200 pages and think about this. And this is a kind of an implicit irony in higher education. You want to encourage your students to take up higher education, and you keep talking about statistics about how many students have actually enrolled into PG after their UG, and you project that as some kind of a progress that India has seen. But unfortunately, having seen so many students stepping into universities, you also have to think about something called employability factor, because we cannot simply think about the pass percentage and we cannot think about grading, because we are talking about not just studying here, because at higher education we are talking about learning. And did we really contribute to the students' learning experience is the question that we got to put to ourselves in the course of our experience as teachers. Did I really contribute to my students' learning experience? Because that it is obligatory that people have got to come into universities. It has also become obligatory for us, the university people, to show good results. And how do you show good results unless you make compromises with the performances of your students? And you, of course, would have developed some kind of a rapport with your students over the course of 2 years, and you might show them some sympathy, and you might definitely grade them slightly higher than what they normally deserve. But will the world outside accept them? Because I'm talking about one very important thing here. Did their educational experience allow them to live outside the classroom with that educational experience, or are they going to disconnect themselves from their educational experiences and think about living without the interruption or intervention of their teachers? In case they choose to live without the interruption or intervention of their teachers outside the classroom, then either they have failed as teachers or we have failed, sorry, they have failed as students or we have failed as teachers. And this failure would definitely haunt us forever. And who is responsible for this? We cannot point fingers at anybody here. Instead, we got to, of course, develop a sense of tenacity and continue to work in this field, thinking that we got to somehow keep negotiating our positions as teachers somehow. Otherwise, things will not work in our favor and will definitely end up with a lot of grievances. If we have to avoid grievances, then we have to somehow think about obligatory higher education as some kind of a norm. And once it becomes ingrained in our thinking as a norm, then we might definitely do something for the well-being, not just of our students, but our own institutions. And I'm saying so much about living outside the classroom with educational experience because this particular topic, in fact, has been triggered not just by my teaching experience, but also by my uh, habit of watching movies. I want to just share with you a small anecdote taken from a movie, which is a Kannada movie. It's a comedy scene, actually. You have one character who happens to go to his native place, having had some very interesting life in Bangalore. And he goes to his native place and he happens to come across his primary school teacher. He feels like talking to his teacher, but he will have his friend alongside him, and his friend takes objection to it. Because there's no point in talking to some teacher who would have taught him maybe some 20 years back, and the teacher may not even remember him. And in the meanwhile, the character I'm referring to, in fact, would not be a very good student either. So such being the case, the other actor says to the uh, uh, student who wants to talk to his teacher that there's no point in talking to your teacher. But the reply by the student is very interesting. He says, this particular teacher taught me mathematics, he taught me grammar and even poetry. But I just want to ask him, like, having taught me so many things in his classes for the whole lot of years, why didn't he teach me how to live? So this actually comes out almost as a comedy scene and it evokes laughter, all right. But the director, having evoked laughter in us, also has got a message to convey to us. He's talking something quite serious about education. And this guy who has had a certain amount of educational experience, in fact, is trying to go back on his school days, and he has a very interesting question to put to his teacher. How come you did not contribute to my life so that I could live? So one thing that we need to remember forever as teachers is the students may not acknowledge what you're doing inside the classroom at the moment of your teaching, but they might definitely remember what you taught them in the course of the time. What I mean here is most part of acknowledgement of your teaching and most part of the learning can also happen retrospectively. So when we register ourselves in the minds of our students today, we got to think about the learning outcome of what we are doing. Because unless we directly link our teaching to what the students actually desire to learn, there is absolutely no point in our teaching experience. Because we normally talk about passion. In case anybody asks you like why you want to become a teacher, your ready-made answer would be like, I have this passion for teaching. And if you want to make some syllabus, you want to make syllabus depending on what you love, and you want to teach certain texts inside the classroom which in fact are your favorite ones. And these favorite texts have been chosen by you because you love them. So who is the actual target for you here inside the classroom for you to teach all that? Only you yourself. But our target are students, right? And there's nothing like our passion which is important in this profession of teaching. It's a very serious business. It's a serious business which involves people called students. We look to an audience there. And these audiences, in fact, are very important for us because we claim to shape up their minds. We claim to contribute to them. Such being the case, we got to somehow think that we need to seriously link our teaching to their learning experiences and desired uh, aspirations. Otherwise, things will not work. And another very important thing that we have to negotiate with here is tradition. Traditionally, we've always thought that students will, of course, be very obedient to us. Why should they be obedient to us? And we always think that they think that we are supreme beings. But those days, in fact, are gone. Students don't really have to think that we are supreme beings with supreme knowledge. We, in fact, are living in such a world where the kind of information that we carry into the classroom may already have been accessed by our students. They are knowing individuals. So we cannot predetermine some kind of a psychological impotency of our students. Instead, we got to, of course, think that in case students come into the classroom with certain kind of educational experience through his own learning by maybe accessing Google, we got to acknowledge that as well, because unless we have the habit of accommodating the dignity and the curiosity of our students, we become failures. It's almost like this. Supposing we have certain illness now during the days when we have this COVID-19 crisis. Do we straight away go to doctors or do we do some research at home? Normally, we definitely access internet to check for what kind of symptoms we have. And unless we are convinced about the symptoms, we'll not approach any doctor. And once we go to a doctor, we almost behave like people who are there to verify the doctor's knowledge. And the doctors, in fact, deal with us with a lot of patience. It could, of course, be quite irritating for the doctors when we ask questions which actually are drawn from internet, but still the doctors will definitely answer all of us very patiently. Such being the case, we also have to somehow replicate the behavior of doctors and accommodate the dignity of our students who actually come with certain kind of prior knowledge of what we are teaching inside the classroom. So this is very important for us. Unless we learn to negotiate this thing, then we are very likely to think that teaching is some kind of a therapy for students who come inside our classrooms with certain kind of deficiency. So if we predetermine this kind of deficiency, then we will definitely fail. And moreover, we cannot hold the attention of our students at all for 1 hour, because they'll start kind of viewing us as some people who don't count. Because every now and then we will be assessed. Students, in fact, think about us almost every time they are inside the classroom, and they'll not just be listening to us. We think that they are listening to us quite seriously, but listening, of course, is happening all right. But in the meantime, the students would also be making certain kind of serious assessment about what kind of a person our teacher is. In such a scenario, we have to negotiate many things at a time and not only perform before them. In the meantime, we also have to make sure that what we are teaching is, of course, going to yield to them something that they have desired. And this learning outcome, in fact, is part of something called the new education policy as well. It's called accountability. We all are accountable not for our paymasters alone. We are accountable more for our students. Because I still remember a chairman of a private college had once asked me, like, how I can contribute to his students in case I'm teaching Wordsworth. And here you cannot talk about literariness, you cannot talk about passion, you cannot talk about beauty of language, romanticism. Many such things might, of course, become part of your defense, all right. But the only thing that the chairman of that private college wanted to know from me was, like, how could I be able to contribute to the students who actually sat in my classes only to learn something called communication skills. So here you got to somehow teach them communication skills as well through your prescribed syllabus, because syllabus is not in your hands unless you are a university yourself. And in case it's a kind of a syllabus that's already been set by somebody else, and if you are doing that, make sure that you will contribute to your students' desired learning outcomes through what you're teaching. Unless you keep doing such research about what your students want, then your classes will become hopeless, and students will not respect us. There's somebody called Alan Bloom, and some of you may have heard of him, and he has written one very interesting book called The Closing of American Mind. He happens to be a philosopher, and he speaks, of course, quite outrageously about liberal education, and certain points that he has to make are very interesting. And one of the things that I found to be interesting was most learning actually happens without much of an intervention from us. And learning, according to him, he gives a very interesting metaphor here. Learning happens, of course, without interruption and intervention. And our teaching is like the work of a midwife. So teaching is midwifery. And giving birth can happen naturally without the intervention of this midwife. And the presence of the midwife is only a kind of a consolation for the woman who is delivering. And he might, of course, do something there to facilitate the delivery, but we can also assume that the presence of the midwife is not the real reason for the birth. It's natural. So according to Bloom, learning can happen pretty naturally. And we are dealing with such learning here. And when we have a syllabus before us, and when we claim that we are going to make something, do something for our students, having heavily, there is something called responsibility before us. So we need to figure out what our responsibilities are as teachers. Our responsibilities precisely are to not simply assume that students come to us with certain kind of deficiency. In the meanwhile, it's not that all students actually can simply assume their responsibility for learning. There could be some students who would definitely depend on us for their learning. So who becomes priority for us are those students who actually need learning from us. In the meanwhile, we cannot ignore the ones who have already done some kind of learning through their access of internet. So we need to somehow balance our act by accommodating both kind of students. I remember one incident from my high school when we had one maths teacher who was quite strict. And he was, of course, a very good teacher, but in one of the geometry classes, a friend of mine had done some problem without the teacher having started it. You may have heard of in-circle and some other circle geometry. I've forgotten that. And this guy who was sitting right beside me had already completed some task. And the teacher who had actually given us some other problem was taking rounds inside the classroom, trying to just oversee how we were doing our work. And when he came across my friend who had already done something which had not been done inside the classroom, he was enraged. And I'm talking about a story of about some 25 years back. And during those days, we were actually being beaten up in case we went slightly beyond the expectations of our teachers. Because teachers, in fact, then actually were supreme beings who actually had to give us everything. Like we are the country who believe in Mahabharata, right? We have Drona, who is actually a very important archetype for us to refer to in case we want to talk about teachers. Drona becomes so important for us. But understand this, Drona, of course, is important for us to understand what an Acharya is. But in the meanwhile, he is also interpreted quite negatively as well because he asked for the thumb of a student. So you have two students of Drona, Arjuna, who actually is a direct student for him, and Ekalavya, who is a distance education student for him. And Drona, in fact, has got special affection for Arjuna. But he becomes quite upset because Ekalavya appears to have learned something without the intervention of Drona in the course of learning of Ekalavya. So Ekalavya has got to be punished, and unfortunately, he has to somehow surrender his thumb. And Kuvempu, who has written a wonderful play called Beralge Koral, mentions about this. And this incident, of course, is not going to end there with Ekalavya giving away his thumb to his guru because the guru asked for it. Later, Kuvempu adds one small incident. When Ekalavya cuts his finger off, there will, of course, be a small pool of blood, and Drona bends down to pick that finger up. When he sees blood there, he happens to see a sword coming towards him and beheading him. And he becomes pretty shocked by that. And what Kuvempu is trying to say here is a teacher has got a very big responsibility, and Drona, in fact, should have accommodated both his students. And that's exactly what we need to learn from all these archetypes. In case we have students who come to us with certain prior knowledge, of course, he or she is very important for us. In the meantime, if there are students who are extremely dependent on us, then we need to balance our act with a lot of patience. Otherwise, students will definitely not like our classes. And like I said, when they want to learn something quite retrospectively, we will remain in their minds as hateful beings. And we need to also think about not just the learning outcomes here, we also have to help the students with the learning strategies. Because some students might definitely have that ability to learn pretty quickly, but there are some people called slow learners, and these words in fact are straight from NAC, if you understand. And what have you done for these slow learners, and have you really conducted remedial classes for them? And these things in fact have got to be done quite seriously. And I'm not trying to propagate something which is part of NAC, but I'm only trying to say that we will definitely have mixed abilities inside the classroom. And here, when we have Arjuna on the one side, we cannot ignore Ekalavya, because this guy in fact has learned something through distance education, but he doesn't really have the privilege of Arjuna. So there is some kind of a lacuna that we have to address in the case of people like Ekalavya. And once we accommodate both extremes, then our teaching will definitely result in learning, because teaching is not just about grading. It's about making students learn. And another very important problem that we have to keep negotiating is no university has come up with language policy. And even UGC has not come up with language policy. Of course, the new education policy has come up with 3-language policy, but they are actually talking about students being exposed to 3 languages at a time. But what about the medium of education? There is always a certain gap here between students who learn things through Kannada medium and the students who learn through English medium. And nobody so far has actually addressed this particular issue conscientiously. And because of this, we always have to have lots of students who come with learning disabilities because the medium of education happens to be foreign for them. And if we can address this particular issue of medium of education, maybe things could improve in higher education. Otherwise, the gap will continue to remain. And we, of course, talk about 3 languages being taught to students, but they are taught as texts. But I'm talking about medium of education. And in case they are exposed to teaching in one language pretty predominantly, then learning can definitely happen in English language. Because when it is higher education, you may all know that they have got to write their thesis in English language. And there could be some provision made by some universities for Kannada, but predominantly it is English language that they got to resort to write their thesis. And if they don't really have enough exposure to English language, how do you think you can assume your students to be in a position to produce thesis of about 200 pages in English language? So the universities and even the UGC or even the governments have got to think in that direction, instead only of thinking about providing students with meals in the afternoon. Those things are of course needed, but in the meanwhile, when you make provision for food, my request with the government as well through this particular webinar is make sure that there is provision for common medium of instruction instead of common syllabus. Because when there is common medium of instruction, that would definitely help students to upscale themselves. Next is our performance and our struggle for acceptance. Have you ever thought about being credited for what you did inside the classroom? Don't we all think that the students have to accept us and the students have got to credit us for their learning? And we all kind of have this craving to be acknowledged. I'm not talking just about the feedback that we receive in writing from students, but in the meanwhile, we need genuine acceptance. We need genuine acknowledgement. And that genuine acknowledgement cannot happen forcefully, because we are not dealing with primary school students, nor are we dealing with PUC kids. We are dealing with thinking individuals, and they are already past 20s and they can definitely do a lot of individual thinking. And when you have such students who can do a lot of independent thinking, you cannot think about developing certain kind of rapport or affinity with them, hoping to get good feedback or hoping to be accepted. Because unfortunately, these kids can definitely manipulate just like our colleagues. They are not in any way different from our colleagues because they are thinking individuals. And when you are dealing with students at higher education, make sure that you simply do your work with a lot of conscientiousness instead of that. If you think about being accepted forcefully, then you will definitely become a pathetic being and you will definitely resort to cross roads. And being accepted need not happen by all students, or in the case of all students. When you go by your myths, you have just one Arjuna for Dronacharya. And when it is Parashurama, he taught only one Karna. So when it becomes important or imperative for you to be accepted, in the course of your teaching, maybe in the span of about 20 or 30 years, you could definitely be remembered by only a handful of students. Nobody can be remembered by a whole lot of students whom you taught in the course of 20 or 30 years. Because in my own experience, I've had students who actually gave me overwhelming feedback. But what actually surprised me was they would have given almost similar feedback to each and everybody of the department. And in the meanwhile, having given such feedback to each and everybody of the department, they also have this habit of carrying tales. So understand this, when you really want to develop closeness with students, especially at higher education, you cannot think about closeness besides profession or professionalism. If you become close with students and start believing in tales, you will definitely become victim of such tales. Because in our craving to be accepted, we think that we have to develop closeness. There is absolutely no need to develop such closeness, because such closeness does happen only in the case of primary school students who are innocent and they need that closeness. And here what matters is professional distance. And when you professionally distance yourselves and do your work, it will definitely work. Because I had once to a friend of mine in MA who wanted to share with one of our teachers her personal problems. And he was, of course, a teacher with a lot of academic background, and we all kind of feared him. She wanted to somehow develop some affinity with him and strike some kind of acquaintanceship with him. She approached him once, and he, of course, was quite uh, annoyed because she wanted to share with him some personal problem. But he simply told her right on the face that it was not part of the syllabus. And moreover, this personal problem, in fact, has got to be somehow solved by the person whoever created it. And the intervention of a teacher cannot happen or cannot yield big results. You may have got grievance cells in your universities, but those things can definitely work only with the help of professionals. But we as teachers cannot think too much about striking certain kind of a chord with our students. Those things don't work. And our educational experience as teachers, another very important thing that we need to negotiate when we are performing inside the classroom. What I mean here is something called our ideological background, our ideological biases, and these things do matter a lot, because anything that you say, in fact, will be interpreted in terms of ideology. Anything you do, anything you wear will be interpreted, especially in universities. It all depends on who you are with, what kind of posts that you do on Facebook, and the kind of forwards that you are sending on WhatsApp to all the groups. And these things will, of course, be interpreted almost every now and then. And when it comes to our own educational experience, we should not romanticize our educational experience in the face of our students. Let us be pretty natural with them. We'll always have this kind of this fetish to say big things about our learning experience, and we always want to somehow consider ourselves to become role models for our students, which did not happen. And let us not romanticize our teaching, our educational experience only to perpetuate obligatory education. Let students not think that we had fantastic childhood, fantastic learning experience. Let us be natural, because we don't really have to present a very utopian picture before our students. And nor are we supposed to create a kind of a schizophrenic scenario before them. Instead, let us be natural, because if we kind of prioritize our ideologies inside the classroom, we will be actually creating a huge amount of dichotomy inside the classroom. And what I mean by ideology here is, if you're dealing with a text that has certain concepts like caste, we have to be slightly politically correct instead of being outrageous. Because being politically correct might definitely sound to be quite hypocritical, but when we are dealing with so many things and when we have to negotiate so many things, it is quite important for us to be as pragmatic as possible. Unless there is certain amount of pragmatism in our teaching, we will of course be bullied by not just students, but others of the university as well. So when we do our writings, when we give our talks, when we post certain things on Facebook, when we send forwards on WhatsApp, we need to be slightly careful. because I used to be quite active on WhatsApp, and I would simply send things randomly to everybody. But one day there was a kind of a rebuttal from a friend of mine who actually doubted my political allegiance. He wanted to know who I supported, because once I had spoken in favor of our prime minister, and some posts that I sent him, in fact, did not seem to really be in consistency with the things that I had said about our prime minister, and he doubted me. And it led to a kind of a debate, and somehow I kind of lost him, because ideology matters so much now that when you are in certain positions, you have to somehow realign your thinking according to what position you are holding on to. Unless you do this realigning, it will become difficult even outside the classroom as well, because your teaching experience will actually depend more upon your educational experience. And if your educational experience has got this veneer of certain ideology, make sure that the ideology that you subscribe to will not affect your professional life. Because uh, if your professional life becomes quite affected by certain ideologies, then you become blacklisted. If your professional life becomes affected by certain other incompetencies, fine. But if it is affected by certain kind of ideological stand, then things become quite difficult. Because one professor of JNU, whom I used to adore because of his talks on diasporic literature, actually has become slightly blacklisted only because he said something against Kanaya Kumar. And he may have said it, of course, in the fit of rage, and he may not really have meant to insult anybody there, and it was not really a cast remark. But because he mentioned something, that actually became a kind of a label against him, like how Girish Karnad was labeled as urban Naxal. You got to be quite careful. I have one small anecdote I want to share with you. You all have heard of U.R. Ananthamurthy. He, of course, had said something about leaving India in case Modi became the prime minister. Almost in the same time, or in the same year, he had mentioned something about Indian gods as well. So at that time, he fell ill. A friend of mine took me to his house just to take a look. And it was only for the first time I was actually talking to U.R. Ananthamurthy face to face. And there was a lot of nervousness in me. But fine, the other person who took me along was actually a close friend of U.R. Ananthamurthy's, and they were talking. Ananthamurthy mentioned something quite interesting about he having lost Vak Swatantriya. Vak in Kannada is articulation, meaning your right to articulate, your right to express, Vak Swatantriya. And there was a pun intended there. He said, I'm not talking just about this Kannada Vak, I'm talking about English walk as well, WALK. I've lost this independent freedom to even walk inside the park at my house because I heard somebody calling me bastard just because I had mentioned something derogatory about Indian gods. So Ananthamurthy, in fact, was a Gnanapithi, and he had produced so much of knowledge for all of us. And his writings, in fact, are always resorted to, and they are part of the syllabuses of all universities across South India and even across India, I believe. Such being the case, he in fact had to live a very grievance ridden life in the end, only because there was some clash which actually had been caused by his ideological stance. So we teachers, in fact, have to be quite careful when it comes to our ideological biases. And understand this, we cannot assume that students learn from what we teach. Students can also learn from what we are. This actually is quite important for me personally, because I quote Purnachandra Tejasvi here. When he wrote something about his own father, he wrote a series of articles on his father, which later became a book called Anna Nenepu. He says his father Kuvempu did not expect his son to become a writer, which means there was nothing like pressure on Tejasvi to become a writer. He became a writer only because he was exposed to a writer. Meaning, your learning can definitely happen only when you're in close proximity with a person who is a learned human being. Like how Vivekananda became Vivekananda because of his proximity with Paramahamsa. What I am trying to say here is you don't have to preach anything to your students. You be what you want to preach to your students, then students will learn from it. Because you don't have to articulate every damn thing verbally, instead, you just practice it. If you want your teachers, I mean, students to be punctual, you be punctual. You be what your students want to learn from you, then they'll definitely learn. Instead of verbally articulating your principles, you follow the principles so that they'll become demonstrations for your students to learn from you. Book learning, of course, is essential, but Alan Bloom says book learning becomes essential only when it is directly linked with what students consider as relevant in the outside world. So we cannot now become quite satisfied with what we actually think is relevant for us. Book learning becomes essential. Book learning becomes very interesting for students only when they find it to be relevant. What is relevance here? This is something which has got more to do with productivity, because in higher education we cannot talk about productivity. We actually talk about thinking, we talk about research, we talk about doing a lot of philosophizing. But philosophizing or thinking or even uh, uh, learning can happen only when we talk about all this in terms of productivity, meaning how employable the students can become through this book learning. So book learning, productivity, all these things in fact have got to be embedded in what we do inside the classroom. So it's a kind of a struggle that we all are involved in, and in this struggle we have to think that these negotiations are quite perpetual, are perennial. Otherwise we cannot survive in this field of teaching. So like Shilpi said, I would rather want to leave the house open for questions now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. So it was a very insightful, informative, and engaging presentation. I could relate to every word you said. Most of us on a daily life, like in a daily life, every day we face the same challenges you spoke about. And we are struggling, like, some people who do not have even the research bent of mind, they are forced into research because it is a UGC norm to have a PhD degree if you want to if you want to teach in a graduate or a undergraduate college. So, like, many would have benefited by your talk today. And I have few questions for you, sir. And I'll start. First question is, it is asked by Professor Yashoda from CMS. She asks, more than respect, disrespect is the order of the day. More than respect, disrespect is the order of the day. To overcome it.
Yeah, Dr. Yashoda, I want to just give you my own example, because I am one of the former employees of your university. Uh, how do you define respect? You have to somehow redefine respect. It is not supposed to be in traditional sense. I'll give you my own experience as an example. After our classes at around 12 o'clock, we always had this habit of going out for tea. But unfortunately, in that particular campus, we did not have too many places for tea, and we had to somehow stand there almost in a kind of a queue along with students to grab our cup of tea. And I had one student of BA who was smoking. And traditionally speaking, you want your students to just scamper away at the sight of the teacher in case they are found to be smoking, but that didn't happen there. Instead, the student very carefully covered the cigarette up and he just nodded to me like this as a gesture of wish. That should be more than enough, because respect has got to be reinterpreted. And I'm very sure, because you work in such institutions where students come with a lot of baggage of experience, learning, and even economical background, they might definitely not kind of behave like how you expect them to behave. But you got to somehow keep yourselves spirited up and flexible. Respect, I mean, disrespect is not really the order of the day. Rather, understand respect in a different way.
Thank you so much, sir. So, another question. This is by Dr. Gitasari Mukherjee. She asks, when research becomes a compulsion, at times quality suffers. The highest educational degree, like PhD, is losing its status to some extent due to poor PhD work. How can we deal with issues like these?
I mentioned it, like we don't really have any way out. You cannot deal with this. Meaning you have to deal with this by way of doing it. That's it. You got to somehow ensure that there is at least minimum quality in what you do, and you just give some hard time to your candidates. Don't compromise with the quality that they are producing, but when it comes to the rush that is there for PhD, you don't really have an option. You have to somehow deal with this, because earlier when we registered for PhD, it used to be a kind of an agreement between candidates and teachers, and it would be only one or two who would register for PhD, and there was nothing like a rush then. But today you have entrance exam, and try to somehow do your entrance exams more strictly. My suggestion here is, try to avoid objective type questions, because PhD is all about articulation. So try to have tests which really take a, which really test their writing abilities, because thinking you can somehow inculcate in them, but written expression is very important. So make your entrance examination more strict by not resorting to objective type questions.
Okay, thank you, sir. So, another question. This is asked by Professor Javeria Noshin. She asks, what is your opinion on the formalistic approach of our education system, which is more result oriented rather than knowledge oriented?
Knowledge oriented, it used to be once. Today, all our institutions, in fact, are answerable to certain bodies like UGC and NAC. And if you are part of an institution which has already been accredited by NAC, you would definitely know like what the criteria are meant for. There is some criteria called learning and evaluation, the second criteria of NAC, which actually asks for statistics, about the number of admissions you have had and pass percentage. And here, in case you are quite knowledge oriented, and if you don't think too much about your pass percentage, your institution will be ranked badly. So today we all are in a kind of a rat race for gradation rather than knowledge production. This is another negotiation that we have to deal with, but unfortunately tenacity matters. You cannot really stave off this fetish for, not fetish, rather obsession for marks. How do you deal with your students, I mean kids, in terms of comparison and in terms of marks? If you are quite exposed to this online education that's happening for kids, my own daughter, who was part of this online education just day before yesterday, there was so much noise coming from other kids' homes because the parents were actually telling the kids to answer properly. So there was some kind of a competition that actually was seen among the parents. because they want their kids to perform well. So this performance, marks, they have become major obsessions, in the modern society, and we cannot help. So try to kind of balance between knowledge and marks.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much. One last question. We have a lot of questions, but I'll take this last question as we are running out of time. Hasn't technology made the teacher-student connect less empathetic, less involved, and more mechanical?
Yeah, think about this on webinar. I mean, this webinar itself. You all are muted, and only I am unmuted. So this is a kind of a one-way talk, and I'm actually talking about democratization of education. So it's a huge irony, right? So yeah, virtual classroom will not really work, and I'll share with you a small post which actually must have become viral by now. Yesterday's that actor's death, Sushant Rajput's death.
Rajput.
Somebody posted something quite interesting. He had so many followers on Instagram, and he had millions of followers elsewhere. Despite that, he was in depression. So this virtual world is a fake one. So technology distances us from our students, but still understand that technology is not really an alternative for regular classroom sessions. It is only a tool. That's it.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for your patience and your support. So as we have come to the end of this webinar, on behalf of Center for Management Studies, Jain deemed to be university, I would like to take the opportunity to thank a few people without whose support this webinar wouldn't have been successful. First of all, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Swami for accepting our request despite his busy schedule. I would like to thank the director, Dr. Dinesh Neelkant, for his unconditional support and encouragement, our HOD, Professor Rupa Teresa, for being our guiding light, Dr. Varsha Agarwal and Ms. Shifa for all the technical help and support and ensuring a glitch-free session. I would also like to thank the English department of CMS, especially Dr. Shiva Chaudhary and Professor Kiran Mane. Last but not least, our ever supportive and enthusiastic participants, thank you all for showing your interest in our webinar. We promise to continue this legacy of knowledge sharing in future also. Take care and have a great evening. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you.